Yes, we have suspended the teacher for 3 months, Tokyo School Board official admitted to reporters. He had his reasons, but we wish to make it clear that ordering pupils to commit hara-kiri is simply no longer acceptable in Japanese schools. The unnamed teacher, aged 28, had overstepped the mark. He was angry because 2 junior high school students, Johnson and John Shitler, had brought candy along on a school camping trip and did not offer to share. To punish them, he placed 2 hunting knives in front of them and told them to disembowel themselves, saying that ritual suicide was the only honourable course they could take. They both refused, whereupon he repeatedly struck them both with a tent pole and had to be restrained by colleagues when he began to fashion a noose from a guy rope. In his defence, he said he was annoyed with them. The education department agreed that Harry Johnson, a 12-year-old pupil at school, can be educated at home. The boy suffers from scholastophobia, a genuine but uncommon illness. For example, even the mention of the word school makes Johnson go berserk. His mum said he would have to think about his future and what he wanted to be when he grew up, so he thought of something good to do. Harry's mum was not very impressed. She reminded him that his efforts had to lead to a career. It was all very well walking across the Channel to France and flying into the sky, but that's not going to lead to a career, is it? It might do, he said. If I did some more, I could get money being interviewed, and then I could write a book about it, like those weirdos who climb mountains and get lost in jungles. Yes, Harry, weirdos, you said it. You don't want to be a weirdo, now do you? It's good fun, answered Harry. Don't be silly, said his mum. Now why don't you get a job, or find a way of making some money? Then you'll have an aim in the morning when you wake up. You're not happy just moping around the house all the time. You'll have to get a job and pay your way in life sooner or later, so the sooner you get started, the better. Mum's right, Harry thought. But what to do? His mate John the Midget had a taxi. Maybe there was some work Harry could do for him. He went to see him. When the taxi passed by, I simply thought to myself, what an ugly family they all were, Officer Burrow told a court. It wasn't until we stopped the vehicle that we discovered the truth. Burrow was speaking at the trial of John Shitler, a 4-foot 2-inch taxi driver who had been arrested on the Accra to Kumasi road. He was speeding, so we gave chase, and ordered him to stop. While my colleague was writing out a speeding ticket, I looked again at the passenger in the front seat, and suddenly realised it was not an ugly person at all, but a pregnant goat in a T-shirt. Investigating further, I found that all 13 other passengers were also pregnant goats, all in T-shirts. They admitted 14 specimen charges of stealing unattended animals from roadside villages in the city region. He and an accomplice, Harry Johnson, admitted they'd been dressing stolen goats in T-shirts for years, so as not to arouse suspicion as they drove home, and had never been apprehended before. Both were remanded in custody for sentence. Asked by the court to explain his behaviour when he stops motorists, Constable Burrow said, I realise spot checks are a nuisance to most drivers, so after I have approached them, I ponder a while. Then I take my sooty glove puppet out, slip it on my hand, and say, Tell you what, sir, let's let Sooty make up our mind for us. Then Sooty whispers in my ear, then I say, Sorry, sir, Sooty says, you're booked, and that's that. When he got out, he went to see John, and told him that he owed him a favour to make up for the debacle with the birds. He asked John to sort out some work, some proper work, and not involving animals, and not involving anything dangerous or dodgy. John had just the thing. A market stall selling perfume. Harry thought about what could be wrong with that, and decided that it sounded pretty straightforward. John explained that you show them the sample, and then sell them a bottle. Simple. And as always, John had a way of totally convincing Harry, even against his better judgment. So he gave it a go. I first tested my new perfume on my way home, Precious Swayo told a magistrate's court in Harare, and I was mightily disappointed when I did not get the sweet and pleasant bouquet that I normally expect from a bottle of expensive French scent. When I got home, I tried it again, and this time I was hit by a pungent smell that made my nostrils burn. My husband said that I smelled like a cross between embalming fluid and glue. Then we both sniffed the container, and I finally realised that those men over there had sold me a bottleful of urine and vinegar for $30. Before passing sentence on John Shitler and his accomplice Harry Johnson, Magistrate told them, You both knew full well what you were doing when you set up your heaven-sent market stall, selling bottles of perfume with famous names like Guerlain, Cartier and Chanel. When women approached your stall, you gave them a tester bottle to try, which contained real perfume. But the sealed bottles you sold them contained nothing but your own piss and a dash of vinegar, which is not at all something that a lady wants to dab behind her ears. You have both displayed a high degree of criminal resolve and purpose, judging from the way the offences were perpetrated, and I therefore sentence you each to 3 months' imprisonment. What is all the fuss about? Demanded Lance Corporal Harry Johnson from his bed in mental hospital. Everyone should dance more often. It cured my headache. Johnson, a 25-year-old policeman, had been arrested after bringing the city's rush-hour traffic to a complete halt. Johnson was on traffic duty at a junction that we police call Hell's Intersection, when, for reasons still unclear, he suddenly threw away his baton, turned all the traffic lights to green simultaneously, and began to dance. Not classical Thai dancing either, more like disco dancing. We have that in Thailand. Drivers were confused. They tried to interpret Johnson's gestures, but that unfortunately ended in chaos. A lorry went through the window of a gun shop. The owner was furious and started shooting at random. But still Johnson danced on. The latest toll is 11 dead and 47 injured, and the intersection was blocked with wrecked cars for more than 8 hours. Justifying his behaviour, Johnson told reporters, "Motorists are filth from the pond. They are always hurling abuse at traffic policemen, but yesterday they scolded me once too often. I hope they've learned their lesson now and will be more polite in future." Harry was fed up with lying around in the garage, and his mum was still hassling him to do something sensible and get a job. So he decided he would be a performance artist. He went round John's, and John knocked up a flyer for him, which he handed out in the local area. It read as follows. At approximately 9:30 a.m. on October the 8th, shortly after I finish lunging at dogs, I will proceed to the front steps of the Simmons building at 2600 Kenilworth Avenue and yell loudly for 9 hours. The screaming will be broken by a 15-minute fit of rigid catatonia, most likely in the late afternoon. I may briefly stray from my agenda to urinate in the revolving door at the building's entrance, but for the most part I will focus on the task at hand and spend the bulk of the day yelling at various passing cars. A lot of what I yell will be pre-planned. It will be things I've shouted at cars before, topics such as bookshelves, those goddamn bananas, the man trying to kill me, closed up straws, Trapper John MD, and papers everywhere. But I definitely want to leave open some room for improvisation. For instance, if a red car passes by, I might be inclined to shout at the driver, "Where do you get the fancy red car, you asshole?" But then if another red car drives by a bit later, I might become angry and demand that the driver stop and give me kidney beans and a lick of his nipple. I've already begun preparations for the event. On Monday I worked late into the night making a bowl of Kraft macaroni and cheese, which I shall bring with me and throw into the street, handfuls at a time. I've also set aside my lucky rubber band and a tree branch for the occasion. I'm liable to shout at any vehicle that goes down Kenilworth Avenue, but I'll focus primarily on Volkswagen Beetles, pickup trucks and late 80s Mitsubishi Gallants. I shall also attempt to gain the attention of cyclists by shouting, "Hey there, Mr. Bikeman!" Although Harry Johnson vows to remain in the office building's doorway throughout his 9-hour yell session, some observers have speculated that he will wander over to the nearest corner, where he will have access to vehicles slowing down to make the turn into Canyon Drive. Harry was impressed. No one else was. He did a bit of lunging at dogs as a warm-up exercise, but no one was there to see him. Maybe he hadn't put out enough flyers. He'd put lots through people's letterboxes, and he'd stood about in the shopping centre handing them out until he got moved on by security. Then one of the cars tried to run him down. Then another one stopped, and 4 big blokes got out and gave Harry a right going over and beat him black and blue. One of them sat on his chest while punching his face, while another one kicked him in the ribs. When Harry recovered, he wanted to perform again. He had learnt to play piano as a child, so he practised lots, and then John organised a concert. The recital last evening in the chamber music room by US pianist Harry Johnson can only be described by this reviewer as one of the most interesting experiences he has witnessed in a long time. With sparse sandy hair, a sallow complexion, and deceptively frail-looking frame, the man who has repopularised Johann Sebastian Bach approached the Baldwin concert ground, bowed to the audience, and placed himself upon the stool. As I have mentioned before, the Baldwin Concert Grand, while basically a fine instrument, needs constant attention, particularly in a climate such as Bangkok. In this humidity, the felts which separated the white keys from the black tend to swell, causing an occasional key to stick, which apparently was the case last night, with D in the second octave. During the raging storm section of the D minor toccata and fugue, Mr. Johnson must be complimented for putting up with the awkward D. However, some who attended the performance later questioned whether the awkward key justified some of the language which was heard coming from the stage during the softer passages of the fugue. During one passage, Mr. Johnson turned around completely, so that whereas before his remarks had been aimed largely at the piano, and were therefore somewhat muted, to his surprise, and that of those in the chamber music room, he found himself addressing himself directly to the audience. But such things do happen, and the person who began to laugh deserves to be severely reprimanded for this undignified behaviour. Unfortunately, laughter is contagious, and by the time it had subsided and the audience had regained its composure, Mr. Johnson appeared to be somewhat shaken. Nevertheless, he swivelled himself back into position, facing the piano, and leaving the fugue unfinished, commenced on the Fantasia and fugue in G minor. Why the concert grand piano's G key in the third octave chose that particular time to begin sticking, I hesitate to guess. However, it is certainly safe to say that Mr. Johnson did nothing to help matters when he began using his feet to kick the lower portion of the piano instead of operating the pedals as is generally done. Possibly it was this jarring that caused the right front leg of the piano to buckle slightly inward, leaving the entire instrument listing at a 35-degree angle from that which is normal. A gasp went up from the audience, followed by a sigh of relief, as Mr. Johnson slowly rose from the stool and left the stage. A few men in the back of the room began clapping, and when Mr. Johnson reappeared a few moments later, it seemed he was responding to the ovation. Apparently, however, he had left to get the red-handled fire-axe which was hung backstage, and began chopping at the legs of the piano. When the weakened legs finally collapsed altogether, and Mr. Johnson continued to chop, it became obvious to all that he had no intention of going on with the concert. The ushers came rushing in, and with the help of the hotel manager, 2 Indian watchmen, and a passing police corporal, finally succeeded in disarming Mr. Johnson and dragging him off the stage. "I do not blame the congregation for their actions," declared Harry Johnson from his hospital bed in Manzini. "They were only carrying out the Lord's will. I blame the brewery. There was too much yeast in the beer." Johnson told reporters how he had sustained his injuries at an all-night peace vigil. "After some beers in the shebeen, I entered the church and took my rightful place in the pew. But the beer was very bad, and it wreaked havoc in my stomach. So I moved to the back of the church, and holding my cheeks apart, so as not to cause offence, began farting quietly. I became drowsy and fell asleep, and the next thing I knew, I was hanging upside down from a Jesus Our Saviour banner, being bludgeoned by hysterical members of the Red Gown Zionist sect. They said I had been farting during lesson, and began hitting me with a large wooden cross. The priest then denounced me from the pulpit, saying that the devil must have sent me to drown out the word of God, because my farting was louder than the rumble of thunder. He told the congregation to drive Satan from his church. So they beat me with crucifixes, fractured my pelvis, broke both my legs, and rammed communion wafers up my nose with crayons from the Sunday school activity box. If I had not crawled out and sheltered beneath the protective branches of an umlanga tree, it could have been serious. And they are now claiming I was hit by a milk truck. Where is the truck? It is a lie. However, I will not prosecute. They are very devout in Manzini.